Somebody says, I know Q. I know that Q is true. The other guy will say, how do you know? Prove it. Prove it. The challenge is, if you can't prove it, then you're just guessing. You may have an opinion, but to claim knowledge, you have to be able to back up what you believe with a proof. I think this is a mistake, because the word proof, as it's usually used, means a kind of consideration that settles the issue for sure, that makes it definite, absolute. It's the kind of consideration which, by its very nature, can't go wrong. So, A says he knows, B says prove it. B's invitation is to A, give me a consideration that settles it for sure, closes the door, makes anything else impossible. So A may present the material that he has. B's only job is to use his imagination and figure out how there's some possibility that he's wrong. If there's a possibility that he's wrong, then he hasn't proven it. So A is giving evidence, experience, argument, statistics, photographs, whatever it is, and B is using his imagination to figure out how it's still possible that A is wrong. I think that that kind of dialogue is a mistake. I think the demand for proof is a mistake. I think that when someone says he knows and you ask him to back it up, what he has to give you is adequate reason, not proof. So he'll give you some reasons why he believes that what he believes. In order to defeat him, it's not enough to use your imagination to think up the possibility that he's wrong. You either have to show that the evidence he's providing isn't real evidence, or you have other evidence against it. That you can't do with your imagination. That you have to either do with logic or you have to do with information that you yourself get. That makes it a much more reasonable dialogue. Now you say, well, that's your prejudice, Gottleib. Who told you that that's right? Let's consider some cases. Do you know who your parents are? I think most people believe they know who their parents are. Okay, prove it. Prove it. Well, they told me. Oh, they did. And you trusted them. How quaint. Surely you know that there are children who are adopted, their parents don't tell them. Well, I look just like my parents. That's because when they went to the orphanage, they took their baby pictures with them, and they picked a baby who looked like their baby pictures, and that's why you look. Well, I had a DNA test done. Now, first of all, you didn't. I know that. But if you had a DNA test done, that doesn't settle it. Maybe the hospital lied to you about the results. They paid them off to lie. You know that? No? Do you really have a proof who your parents are? Where you couldn't be wrong? You certainly do not. Now somebody says, well then stop saying you know who your parents are, because you really don't. I don't think you agree. Something's wrong. I certainly know who my parents are. And if I don't have a proof, so much the worse for proof. I'll give you another example. Somebody's accused of a crime, and you have all sorts of circumstantial evidence, and you have two eyewitnesses who positively identify him. And the defense attorney says, suppose that the defendant has an identical twin. Identical twin, looks just like him. Then you wouldn't know that this person sitting here did it, would you? With the identical twin could have done it, right? So you don't know for sure that the guy sitting here did it, because it's possible there's an identical twin that no one knows about, that there's no birth certificate for, that the birth registry doesn't have, but it could be, could have avoided all that, so you don't know. If you don't know, you can't convict. I think we can convict. You don't have to rule out the possibility of an identical twin in order to convict someone of a crime. If he wants to use identical twin as a defense, let him bring the identical twin, or let him bring evidence that the identical twin. Then we would take it seriously. But just to point out the possibility that it might be wrong, because there could be an identical twin, that doesn't defeat the claim to knowledge. Many philosophers, even today, are of the opinion that you can't really prove anything. Because some of the things that we thought once upon a time we could prove, we discovered later that they could be questioned in tricky ways that we didn't think of. And that gives you a little less confidence in your reasoning ability. If I failed that time, so then, maybe I could fail another way, another time, in another way. People have intuitions about time, that time is what it is, and it is what it is everywhere, the same. And Einstein comes along and says, no, time is what your clock does, and somebody else's clock, whose motions you expect, your clock does other things. So he has his time, and you have your time. My time, his time? That doesn't sound right. But that's what Einstein will tell you. Here's an example, a very radical example. I know this is the name of Bertrand Russell, but maybe it goes further back. There is some discussion as to how old the universe is. What about someone proposing that the entire universe is 5 minutes old? 5 minutes old, as of now. So you say, Rabbi, I remember last year. No. 5 minutes ago, you came into existence with the programming in your brain, which gives you the impression, the belief, the false memory of what happened a year ago, but it didn't really happen because you came into existence 5 minutes ago. What have you got against that? What could you say against that? How could you prove that that's not so? The hypothesis is that 5 minutes ago, everything came into existence just as if it would have been if there had been a long past. It's just that it came into existence 5 minutes ago. By the way this alternative is expressed, you see that whatever evidence you're going to use, he builds it in by saying, well, that's how it came into existence 5 minutes ago. Or Descartes' famous example, do you know that at this very moment you're not dreaming? I'm sure you think it's a nightmare, right? Maybe in 2 minutes you'll wake up in the 22nd century and say, that's what I get for reading history books. I've dreamt myself back 200 years ago. And if you can't prove that you're not dreaming, then maybe you're dreaming and maybe all the things that are happening to you aren't real. Well, there's only really a dream, it's not real. Somehow, let's make this concrete, You lent somebody money 2 weeks ago, he owes you the money, and you go to him and you say, I'd like my money back. And he says, you must be joking. When did I borrow it? And you say, 2 weeks ago. And he says, I say that wasn't 2 weeks ago. Then it wasn't 2 weeks ago. The world was created 5 minutes ago, and you're just falsely believing that it was 2 weeks ago. Prove me wrong. And you can't prove me wrong. How can you claim my money? The answer is easy, because that's not an alternative that I have to rule out. That's too far out as an alternative that I have to rule out. My thesis is that to back up your claim to knowledge, you don't use proof. You use reason, adequate reason. And the adequate reason can be evidence that gives a high enough probability or is strong enough to operate on, but not absolute proof. The demand for proof is a trap. Because if someone demands that you present the proof, he's setting up a situation where you'll say whatever you say, and he's cogitating in his imagination, maybe it was E.T., extraterrestrials, You can't prove there weren't extraterrestrials. Maybe they manipulated the whole thing. It didn't really happen. And then you lose. Because you set it up that he's got to defeat your imagination. My recommendation is don't accept that game. Don't play that game. What you say to him is, I'll present reasons for you, reasons and evidence, and either you show that my evidence is a mistake, it's really good evidence, or show me you have evidence against me, or show me my evidence is too weak. But just thinking of the possibility that I'm wrong, indeed, when I go into discussions like this, I start by saying, I'm going to give you considerations in favor of my view, but I tell you right up front at the beginning, it could be that I'm wrong. I acknowledge that. I'm not pretending that I can rule out every other alternative absolutely, so it's impossible. I'm just saying I have good enough reason to believe what I believe. Somebody put in a room boxes, square boxes, packed closely together that fill the entire room. There are 1,000 of these square boxes. 999 of them are colored white. One is colored black. Someone I know walked into the room, shut his eyes, and threw a stone. It landed in one of the boxes because the boxes cover the whole floor. Did it land in a white box or a black box? I say, I'm willing to commit myself that it was a white box. Couldn't it have been in the 1 out of 1,000 boxes, which is black? Yeah, it could, but it's 1 in 1,000 chance. I don't take a 1 in 1,000 chance seriously. I'm betting on white, and I'm willing to raise money on white, and I'm willing to make decisions on the basis of white, even though it could be black, but it's too improbable to take seriously. I think that's perfectly responsible. And it's perfectly responsible to respect and honor and revere your parents, even though you could be wrong. Could be wrong is not a realistic reason to give up what you believe. Now here, sometimes these things sneak in with a certain type of vocabulary that suggests it, and you have to be sensitive to it to know where to draw the line and say, no, I'm not doing that. For example, you present reason why you believe something, and somebody says, how do you know it's not some alternative? You say it's X. How do you know it's not Z? You've already given reason to think that it's X. And he says, how do you know it's not Z? Usually, when he says that, what he means is, rule Z out. Rule it out. Show me that Z can't be right. I think the appropriate thing to do when somebody says, how do you know it's not Z, is to say, I've presented evidence that it's X. What you want is to see that my evidence counts against Z. It counts against Z. It gives you reason to doubt Z or to reject Z. That I can provide you. That's all it's fair to ask me to provide. But to rule out Z absolutely? No. People are convinced that a certain public event took place. Maybe it's a mass hallucination. Maybe it's a mass psychosis. I don't have to defend against that. My answer is, yeah, maybe. But I have no reason to think that it's actually true. So I believe what I believe, even though maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's wrong isn't a reason to give up what you believe. Now, this happens, this is accompanied with another piece of logic, which when they sort of go hand in hand. And that is when you're having a discussion, there's something called burden of proof. If you are an American, you're probably aware that in an American court, when you're trying a criminal case, you have a prosecutor and you have a defense attorney. The job of the prosecutor is to show that the defendant is guilty. He has to show it beyond, how does it go? The American? Beyond a reasonable doubt. Notice carefully what that says. Not beyond a doubt, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. Means there could be doubts that we're leaving over. There could be doubts that we're tolerating. They're just not reasonable. That's like, maybe he has an undiscovered and unknown identical twin. And maybe the identical twin did it. That's an unreasonable doubt. Yeah, we know that he was 200 miles away an hour before the murder. So the defense attorney says that he couldn't have been there to commit the murder. And the prosecutor says, maybe he hired a helicopter. Helicopter could get there in less than 2 hours, couldn't it? Yeah, but that won't help you prosecute. No one's going to take that seriously. It's possible, but it's only possible. Things like that usually have evidence. Helicopters aren't available for casual rent, especially when you need to get someplace in 2 hours to kill somebody. So when somebody says, how do you know it's not? I recommend reformulating it and saying, you want to have reason to think that it's not? I give you reason. The burden of proof looks like this. The prosecutor has to prove his case beyond a reasonable doubt. What's the job of the defense attorney? Not to show that he's innocent. That's not his job. The job of the defense attorney is to show that there is a reasonable doubt. That's all. If the prosecutor succeeds, we have good reason to say he's guilty. If the defense succeeds, we have good reason to say we don't know what happened. All he's done is show there's a reasonable doubt, that's all. The prosecutor might still be right, and he might be wrong. The defense attorney has a very easy job. All he has to do is show this some weakness in the evidence that the prosecutor provides. Okay, now, if two people are having a discussion, A and B, there are really three ways, well, two are symmetrical, ways to organize the discussion. You could play A as prosecutor and B as defense. That means A has the burden of proof. He's got to present evidence that closes the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And B has the weak job of simply showing that there's a reasonable doubt. Or you could switch sides. Or, conceivably, both sides could play a role of prosecutors. Both sides could be presenting evidence simultaneously, each one trying to show that he's right beyond a reasonable doubt. I recommend you don't do the last option. Don't do it. It's because you're playing both offense and defense at the same time, and it makes the remarks in the discussion very difficult to evaluate. When B responds to A, what is he doing? Is B simply trying to cast doubt on A's argument, or is B trying to show that he's correct? I recommend at the outset you make a decision. We'll start. A will try to prove his point, and B will try to cast doubt, and then we'll switch it for the second half. B will try to prove his point, and A will try to say it. That way you know exactly what's being done. Otherwise, you risk the burden of proof being shifted in the middle of the debate. I'll give you a few examples of how that happens. It happens in science, it happens in philosophy, it happens in religion. Evolution, with which there are many, many, many problems. But I'm just picking one as an illustration of logic now. My subject isn't evolution tonight. Evolution is supposed to take place by gradual transformations. Darwin said so, and it's the orthodoxy. Large transformations almost always will be simply fatal. So it's supposed to be gradual. Now the fossil record doesn't show the gradual transformations. Eldridge and Gould's famous paper in the 70s, punctuated equilibria. It just doesn't show smooth transitions. There are whole families that come in without any precursors. So now the critic says, so your evidence for evolution is weak. You yourself told us that have to be gradual transitions. The fossil record is the evidence we have for the transitions that took place. Your evidence is weak. And so far, the person believing in evolution is supposed to be proving his case, and the critic is saying, here's a doubt, here's a weakness, here's a hole that you haven't plugged. Now suppose the person who believes in evolution says, we have an answer for that. The answer is, this was this early formulations of punctuated equilibria, that in isolated small populations, evolution could take place very rapidly. Very rapidly, that means that instead of taking a million years, it would take 50,000 years. Okay? And now, a small population in a period of 50,000 years leaves almost no trace in the fossil record. First of all, it's a very small area. To find it would be you'd have to be very lucky. And second of all, 50,000 years, in terms of the strata, doesn't cover much ground. So we say that it was gradual, and the gradual changes took place in an isolated population, which you won't find. So now, what shall the critic do at this point? Well, he's implicitly being invited, show me that didn't happen. Show me there aren't isolated populations over short periods of time in which the evolution wasn't gradual. Show me. That's what's called shifting the burden of proof. Because we started by asking the believer in evolution for reason to believe what he says, that it really happened that way. When he's faced with the gaps in the fossil record, he says, it's possible that it happened in a way that nobody could notice. That doesn't answer the critique. That doesn't give me reason to believe that it happened. They're telling me what you show. You're not showing me evidence. You're simply telling me that it's possible. I didn't claim it was impossible. I never said it was impossible. I just said there isn't enough reason to think that it's true. Lots and lots of things are possible that aren't true. Leprechauns are possible. Not true. Six-headed calves are possible, but they're not true. So what happened is you started off by presenting evidence, and then when you're caught with a contradiction, you present the possibility to avoid the contradiction. You've lost the project. The project was, give me enough evidence to convince me that what you say is true. If you have to appeal to possibilities, you're not doing that. Possibilities aren't evidence. All a possibility can do is show that the other guy hasn't ruled you out. That wasn't the project. The project wasn't to defend yourself against the critic. The project was to present your evidence that you're right. So the shift between is and is possible is the shift between proving, establishing that you're right versus defending yourself against the critic. That's called shifting in the burden of proof. Is there a God? Show me there's a God. Prove there's a God. That's the challenge. That we've already rejected. Prove means to establish beyond the possibility of mistake, infallibly. That's not the project. Okay? So now, we present evidence that, for example, the Big Bang, or certain events that can't be explained in natural terms, or other matters like that. And the other guy says, how do you know it's not E.T.? Yeah, we understand that, but, or how do you know that it's just not just a fluke? Improbable things happen. And this is just a fluke that happened by accident. How do you know it's not? At that point, we should say to him, you're asking me to rule this out? I can't do that. I agree at the outset that there are other possibilities. I'm not trying to eliminate all of the possibilities. But since all you can say about your alternative is that it's possible, you have no positive reason whatsoever to think that it's correct, that's actually true, you're only claiming that it's possible, then I say that I have positive reason to think that I'm right, and it's possible that I'm wrong, and therefore, because I have positive reason, it's appropriate to accept my position. All you need is enough positive reason. You don't need proof. This goes on in ethics. You believe in a certain ethical position. And somebody says, but you're just trusting your reasoning and your perception and your experience and your culture. Isn't it possible that there's another point of view that sees things differently? Without any evidence of an actual position like that. Just, it's possible. So that's, at that point, he's asking you to rule out that possibility. You shouldn't accept that. You shouldn't accept that. And it happens when, for example, somebody says, I believe in absolute morality. There are rules of morality, and they're correct, they're objective, and somebody denies it, he's just making a mistake. And someone says, yeah, back it up. Back it up. Show me that, in fact, that it is so. And you give reasons, and he is unconvinced by your reasons. And let's say he even has objections to your reasons that are not totally wrong, not totally implausible. And here's the crucial last move. So he says, aha, so you couldn't show that it's objective, so therefore it's subjective. No, that's not right. If you couldn't show it's objective, then you didn't show it's objective. If you didn't show it's objective, you don't know that it's objective. But that doesn't mean you know it's subjective. There are three possibilities. One possibility is to know it's objective. One possibility is to know it's subjective. One possibility is not to know. I don't know. I guess I'm just in doubt because I don't know which one of them is. I thought objective morality was correct. I thought I had good reason to think so. He defeated my reasons. But that doesn't show it's not objective. It just shows I haven't succeeded in showing that. That's shifting the burden of proof. So this has to be taken into account all the time. Who has the burden of proof, number one, and also not to be trapped into giving a proof. Now I'm going to, this is all straight logic so far. Now I'm going to give you a piece of advice in terms of strategy. If you're talking to a person who is not religious, which today is almost synonymous with anti-religious, typically those people think they know that religion is wrong. They want to do it on the basis of science, or on the basis of general morality, or on the basis of psychology. They think they know. So my suggestion is, invite them to accept the burden of proof because they say they know. And now don't call it burden of proof, call it burden of reason, of adequate reason. And invite them to show you their reasons why they're convinced that religion is not true. And you take on for yourself the easy position of simply raising reasonable doubts. That's all. And you can say that at the outset. And if you're challenged, you may say, look, I don't claim to know that I'm right. I'm exploring. I'm investigating. I'm trying to see what the reasons are that people have for what they believe. This is what Socrates really did, even though he could be criticized in certain ways. But what he used to do with people, he'd say to people, you're making a decision, you're taking certain actions, you're passionate about it, you're convinced you're right. Please share with me your reasons for thinking you're right. I'd like to know what they are and see if they're adequate. If Socrates is challenged, he would say, I'm not taking any position at all. You're taking a position. One guy he caught on the way to prosecute his father for murder. You're prosecuting your father for murder? That's pretty drastic. You really must think you know what you're doing. You wouldn't do that unless you were very, very sure that you're right. Let me hear your reasons why you think that you're right. Socrates is not saying he's wrong. He's simply saying, let me hear the reasons that you're right. I think when a person presents his reasons against religion, if you define the discussion that way, you need to convince me that you're right by giving me adequate reason. My job is to simply show you that there are doubts about your reasons, that your reasons aren't as strong as you think they are, and they really aren't convincing. If you do that, you avoid the switching in the middle where the guy says, well, if you think that you're right, prove that you're right. I wasn't coming to do that. I was simply wanting to hear your reasons for rejecting religion and to see whether the reasons for rejecting religion are adequate reasons. Okay, I hope that the logic of the situation is reasonably clear. Now, there is, in particular, with respect to religion, there is one other move that I would like to share with you. This was, I would say it's fairly obvious to people who engage in these things. I saw a nice discussion of it in the writings of Peter van Inwagen, who was I think he's a very excellent philosopher, happens to be a religious Christian. He's a very excellent philosopher. Let's take science and religion. So many people will tell you science rules out religion. There's something funny going on here. Let me start with this observation. I think that Freudian psychology is drastically deficient. Because Freudian psychology cannot explain chemistry. There's nothing to say about chemistry. So, Rabbi, what? So what? I mean, psychology is about psychology. It's not about chemistry. It's not a fault of psychology. It doesn't explain chemistry. They're two different disciplines. They have two different vocabularies. Okay, gotcha. I guess each discipline has a job within a certain subject matter to explain that subject matter, and you don't evaluate it by its inability to explain other subject matter. Okay, fine. So tell me, what's the subject matter of science? Physics is about particles and forces and interactions and the construction of complex atomic structures out of simpler particles and interactions and so forth and so on. And chemistry is about megamolecules and chemical processes and so forth and so on. Each one is what it's about. Okay. Tell me something. If I take physics, take chemistry, take biology, even take evolutionary biology, is one of the scientific terms, the vocabulary of this science, God? Do they have theories about God? Observations about God? Analyses of God? Not really. Physics doesn't talk about God. Astronomy doesn't talk about God. Chemistry doesn't talk about God. Biology doesn't talk about God. So how is it possible to have a conflict between science and religion when the vocabulary of religion isn't part of the vocabulary of science? How is that possible? It's only possible if there's something that religion says about science. If religion takes a certain scientific stand, if religion puts its acceptance on some scientific idea or principle, or if religion defines, let's say, God in ways that use terminology which is part of the terminology of science, then science could step in and say, well, this principle creates a bridge between religion and science, and now, with that bridge, some of our scientific findings could be relevant to assessing religion. But there's got to be a bridge. Otherwise, it's like psychology and chemistry. Chemistry doesn't say about psychology doesn't say about chemistry. They're just two different fields, two different disciplines. So, where's the bridge going to come? And the bridge is going to be in something that gives religious content to something that science could analyze. Who's responsible for that bridge? Where must the authority for that bridge come from? I'll give you a practical example. This is very abstract. Then I go back to evolution. One of the arguments that evolutionists use all the time against the idea of divine creation is this. Creatures have in their design, their physical design, all sorts of weaknesses, faults, mismanagement. Of course, every example that they give, the examples are usually shown to be a mistake, like the eye wired backwards is just a mistake. It's a mistake in biology. But okay, let's leave that aside. I'm interested in the logic, not in the facts. They're wrong with the facts also. They say, well, the eye is wired in a very inefficient way. Okay, let's say so. And if there were a God who really is all-powerful and really knows everything and really is benevolent, then he would have wired the eye in a better way. Okay, so there's the bridge. The bridge is, this is what God would do in our world about the eye, and then we could check whether the eye is done that way. That's the bridge, okay? Okay, but now, who's responsible for that bridge? Where does that come from? Which religion says that? That since God is all-powerful and all-knowing therefore he will create things in the best possible physical way? I don't know any religion that says that. Indeed, our religion, and these principles are certainly common to other religions as well, say that one of the principles that God had in creating the world is to hide his activity. So his activity won't be obvious. If that's the case, to make things in a less than optimal way, so as to hide the fact that he's doing it, would be very natural from our point of view. So, when the person using science against religion says, well, the eye proves there is no God, it only proves there is no God on the basis of the bridge principle, which he made up, there are never any footnotes. When they cite these bridge principles, there are never any footnotes. And that being the case, he's fighting against his made-up God. He's not fighting against any religious position. You've got to have a bridge principle. And the bridge principle, if you're going to fight with a particular religion, then it ought to come from the literature of that particular religion. Otherwise, you're shadowboxing. So the idea of a conflict between science and religion is only if religion pledges allegiance to a principle that is accessible to science. Now, it isn't as if that never happens. We do. We pledge allegiance to the finite age of the universe, for which we were left out of the academy for thousands of years until 1965. We pledge allegiance to free will, which means that your processes of making a decision aren't like the way your washing machine works or the way your computer works. They're different in principle from those things, and that's something which in principle could be investigated by science. But without those bridge principles, it's impossible to. And if you get the bridge principles wrong, so for example, there used to be an argument from evil: if God is all good, and God is all knowing, and God is all powerful, there can't be any evil. And since there clearly is evil in the world, then that proves that there isn't a God meeting those descriptions. So, the question is, which religion do you know which denies the existence of evil? I don't know anything. Certainly not the three Western religions. None of them deny the existence of evil. So, you, the physicist, are making this up. Seems to me that if God is all-knowing and all good and all-powerful, shouldn't be any evil. That's the way it seems to me. So therefore, since there's evil, there can't be any God. Yeah, okay, so the God that seems to you is in trouble. But it had nothing to do with religion, because religion doesn't say that. All the major religions recognize the existence of evil and explain it in various ways. Yeah.
Otherwise, because the critic poses a non sequitur to begin with, say that because of this, because of A, B cannot happen. Like he's saying like something that's unrelated to something, and he's trying to combine it.
Let's see. You're asking whether he's guilty of a non sequitur. I think it's true, but it's a little more subtle than you make it out. He thinks it is a logically relevant argument because he's using a bridge principle. Mm-hmm. What he's not doing is taking responsibility for the bridge principle. Mm-hmm. If you're attacking somebody's position, you better make sure it's his position. If you're attacking Christianity and you're going to use a bridge principle, make sure that Christians believe the bridge principle. Mm-hmm. If they don't, then you're just shadowboxing. And they've been criticized, the new atheists have been criticized by many of being ignoramuses. of real religious positions, and so they're attacking what's called a straw man argument. So, for example, let's take, poor Richard Dawkins. He has what he calls the master argument against religion. And the master argument is this. One of the reasons people accept religious ideas is because they say the universe is complex and looks designed, and it needs an explanation for why it's designed that way. And the natural explanation is that there's a designer who designed it that way. And by the way, he and everyone else in evolution agrees that the world looks designed. They all agree to that. The great glory of evolution was supposed to be that it explained why it looks designed without being designed. But nobody says it's just a hallucination. Things look contrived. They're complex. They have many interlocking pieces. The pieces work together in extremely efficient ways. They reliably produce certain outcomes. Right? They look like designed things. Just that they think that they can do without it. So now he says, well, to infer the existence of a designer on the basis of the fact that what you see is complex is wrong, because if the thing you're looking at is complex, how complex is the designer? Designer of X, you would usually assume, is at least as complex as X, and probably more so. Because if he designed it, he has to contain enough information to describe the whole of X, plus the process of producing it. So he's going to have more complexity in and of himself than the thing that he's designing. Right? So then it's an endless chase, because then you'll ask who designed the designer, right? And it's going to be an endless chase. So there are a lot of things wrong with this argument, but one of them with respect to religion is this. When you say, Sir Richard, that the designer is more complex than the thing designed, you're basing yourself on certain physical models. Well, the religious belief is that God made the world and God is ultimately simple, because God isn't a physical object. So your inferences from physical objects don't apply to something that's not a physical object. And furthermore, God's existence is necessary, so asking who designed God is out of court. You only ask who designed X if you think that X was designed. But if your understanding of X is that it wasn't designed, it just always was, and it always necessarily is what it is, then who designed it? That can't arise. So arguing from the complexity of the result to the complexity of the designer and using that to rule out God is to make the classical mistake of not attacking an appropriate bridge position. If you want to attack the religious position, you've got to do it in religious terms. That something simple can't produce something complex, physical or not physical. You've got to do that philosophically. Let's hear you do it. You haven't done that. Your clever master argument, which is exactly one paragraph long, right, doesn't address that at all. So that's the problem of the bridge principle. Also, his remarks about the natural world are desperately incorrect. In mathematics, you have a few very simple axioms which deliver untold numbers of theorems, strictly speaking, infinity of theorems, many of which are very complex and very subtle, much more so than the axioms. You can develop lots of complex things on the basis of simple beginnings. In fact, the vocabulary of mathematics, I'm speaking as someone who taught philosophy of mathematics, so I'm talking about formal mathematics. The vocabulary of mathematics, all of the concepts of mathematics can be derived from one single starting concept, and that's set membership. That one thing is a member of a set. If you have that concept, you can define everything. Functions and spaces and tensors and analysis and Fourier transformations and whatever you want. All of it can be defined from one single starting concept. So really, from a simple origin, you can't get complex things? I don't know that that's correct. And then let's go back to early physics. Once upon a time, there were only 3 particles. Before that, there were only 2. There were only 3 particles: electrons, protons, and neutrons. And the thought was, everything in the universe is made out of those 3 particles. That's not a gigantic simplification? How could everything come from just different arrangements of 3 particles? How is that possible? Yeah, but that's what they thought. So now today it's 46 particles, or 48 or 64 particles. Still 64 for tens of thousands of different materials. This is a gigantic simplification. Why do you think that complex things have to have complex origins? That doesn't follow at all. You know, masses of ants, when they march, can cross bodies of water. And the way they do it, they build a bridge of ants over the water, a live bridge. And then they all go tramping over the bridge, right? They found that the whole thing is based on one simple rule, that you keep going as long as all 4 feet are on the floor. As soon as all 4 feet are on the floor, you stop going. So let's say one ant reaches the edge of the water. Another ant climbs on top of him. On top of him, but when he gets to a certain point, the front legs are hanging in the air, so he stops. The next one climbs out on that one and goes to his front, where his legs are hanging in the air. And that's all it is. And they keep doing that till they have a bridge across the whole thing. A simple binary rule, which enables this kind of pseudo-organization of ants to create a bridge. The rule is very simple, and the result is quite complex. It's just not true intellectually that simple origins can't give rise to complex complexes. I don't know if you know about the game of life. This was a very, very early computer game. What was the guy's name who thought it up? I forget his name. You have a grid, and the squares in the grid can either be black or empty. And then you have simple rules like if a square is empty and it's in contact with 4 black squares, it becomes black. And if it's black and it's in contact with 3 empty ones in a row, so then it becomes empty again. And then you just run these rules at high speed, and you get flashing patterns on the grid. And they found that certain rules like that, simple, blind, meaningless rules, gave rise to floaters, shapes that float across the screen comprehensively. Eaters, some things come and they swallow up the other one. They become a bigger blob, right? Mm-hmm. No one dreamt of that outcome. No one was playing that outcome. They were just playing with the rules, 3 and 4, 4 and 2, and then suddenly a certain combination of rules gave rise to these very complex, coherent pictures. So the idea that complex outcome requires a complex designing mechanism, it's just a failure of knowledge of how the world works. At any rate, this is a good example of how someone's going after a religious conclusion without paying attention to the relevant bridging proposition, and therefore what he says has no application whatsoever. Yeah.
If we're going back to the idea with the everything comes from 1 or 2 particles, just chemically speaking, wouldn't that mean that everything comes from hydrogen, which is impossible in its own right? Because there has to be other elements that bond to hydrogen, right? To make
no, it's not true, because there's something called nuclear fusion. Fusion means you take the contents of 2 nuclei and they become one nucleus. Mm-hmm. They can fuse together. And then you can build larger and larger nuclei out of simpler nuclei. That's why, according to the current theory, the heavier elements are made in stars, where the gravitation and pressure is enormous, and especially in stellar explosions, where the force of the explosion creates tremendous compression, and there the nuclei are pushed together, and then you get heavier elements. So you can start with simpler elements and create heavier elements out of them.
But the properties couldn't have been created like out of nothing.
Did anybody say anything about out of nothing? I didn't say it before. You're introducing it now. We weren't. You said from hydrogen. Yes, from hydrogen. These things can. Nobody talked about something coming from nothing. Nobody spoke about that, right? So that's not part of the discussion right now. Question is, if you have an existing simple basis, can you get out of the existing simple basis existing things that are more complex? Nobody was talking about coming out of nothing. Yeah.
Does that kind of explain how black holes kind of work? Almost the gravitational pull, you're saying?
But it's much worse there because the gravitation is so horrific that it obliterates the particles altogether.
Right.
All you have left in a black hole is mass, a sum total of mass, charge, and spin. But individual ingredients are demolished. Then you have neutron stars where it's a sort of on the way to a black hole where the atomic structure is destroyed. You don't have protons and you don't have electrons. You just have neutrons, and a thimbleful of a neutron star weighs about as much as planet Earth. It's I think the most compact thing, sort of a black hole. But they. I don't know. But the question is what radiation they give off, and you can identify it. I understand there's no question that there are neutron stars. It wasn't how much mass they had at the beginning. When they go through a nuclear explosion, go through when they blow off the external gases and they leave behind a core. Question is how big the core is. And if it's heavy enough, it squeezes the life out of the atoms. The atom's atomic structure is destroyed, and only the neutrons remain behind. At any rate, I think that the use of reason is tricky and it's subtle, and if you can avoid consistently the temptation to think in terms of proofs, I think you're a big step ahead. I found this to be a tremendous obstacle. That's why I devoted a chapter of my book to discussing this, to show that that's the wrong thing to be looking for, proofs. The right thing to be looking for is adequate reason. Okay.